just seen the exit poll. It's weird after so much speculation about how wild the results could be. It's not disappointing, but it's well within the bounds of what now feels like the new normal. So in terms of this podcast series, it's not 1924. It's more like, though it looks like it's going to be the Tories' worst result ever, more like 1906 or 1945 or 1997. And yet, it could mean so many different things. The SNP have been wiped out in Scotland. That is almost the most dramatic result of all. Scottish independence is now done for a long, long time, I suspect. The Lib Dems have got a lot of seats, not many votes. Yeah, they're already talking. It's 5 minutes since the exit poll, and the channel that we're watching, they're already talking about how vulnerable it makes Keir Starmer to have such a big majority on what they're assuming is such a small vote share. Yeah, amazing.
And Nigel Farage has won in Clacton, his 8th attempt to get into Parliament. I think that's healthy, actually. I don't share his politics, but he clearly speaks for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the country. Those voices deserve representation. Let's see how he votes now. It's nearly 5 o'clock, and Jacob Rees-Mogg is up. I used to mow his family graveyard. There were the Reeses at one end, the Moggs at the other, and at some point they met in the middle. And he's gone. Politically, at least, he too is now 6 feet under. It's 6:45, and Liz Truss has lost her seat. The lettuce has hit the iceberg. She joins a list of former Prime Ministers who have lost their seats: Asquith, Balfour, Ramsay MacDonald, a place in the history books.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
It's 8 o'clock in the morning, almost all the results are in, and a couple of bleary-eyed thoughts. First, I don't think we're paying enough attention to the Green Party vote. The Greens won 800,000 votes in 2019. They're heading for 2 million at this election. They've won 4 seats, which is the same as Reform UK. And they've done that by positioning themselves as a challenger party on Labour's left. And I think that's going to be quite interesting to watch over the next 5 years. Secondly, Reform have won 4 million votes at this election, which is only a touch higher than the 3.9 million that UKIP won in 2050. The Tories were able to cannibalise that vote in 2017 and 2019 because they became the party of Brexit. But ironically, getting Brexit done has reopened the political space for Nigel Farage.
I will shortly be seeing His Majesty the King to offer my resignation as Prime Minister. To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, and that was a little microcosm of the election that was. This is the last episode in our historic general election series, and Robert Saunders and I are going to be talking about an election that is just a few hours old. We can't talk about it as historians, but we are going to try and make sense of what just happened and what it might mean for the future. Robert, one of the things we talked about in this series, I brought it up a bit, you didn't always bite, was trying to speculate about whether the 2024 election would compare to any of the ones that we've discussed. And at one point I put it as, is this going to be more like 1906, which in a way was similar to 1945 and 1997, those Tory defeats, landslides for the opposition? Or might it be like 1924, not the Tories, but the Liberals, a wipeout event, a sort of extinction level event where one of the main parties is reduced to a number from which there is no recovery. So it doesn't seem to be 1924, but also it's not really the others either. I mean, it's the worst result in Tory history. It's 121 seats. That's quite a long way off even those terrible results. Do you think there's a historical comparison here? Do you feel it with any of the ones that we talked about, or do you think this one is its own thing?
I think fundamentally, every general election is unique to the time in which it happens, and that's why elections are such interesting things for historians to study. But I suppose there are probably three big stories about the election that we've just had, and we might look to different points in history for each of them. So the first is the obvious point that a Labour Party that seemed to be dead and buried in 2019 has roared back to win one of the biggest landslide majorities in history. It's only 5 years ago that Boris Johnson was towering over British politics like a kind of cross between the angel of the north and the honey monster. And suddenly that world has completely disintegrated. So we have to go back to 1906, I think, for a turnaround of that scale from a landslide defeat to a landslide victory. And then the second story of the night has to be the absolute collapse of the Conservative Party. This is its lowest ever share of the vote, its lowest ever number of MPs. The Grim Reaper's been driving a combine harvester through the cabinet. We've never really seen anything on this scale before. And that invites us perhaps to think about how the Conservative Party might respond. Is it going to be 1945, where the Conservatives are competitive again by 1950 and back in government by 1951? Or is it 1997, where they go into the political wilderness? It takes 13 years even to come back to being the largest party in a hung parliament. And in the third story, which is the one I think that hasn't had as much attention as it deserves, is the cratering of the SNP in Scotland. That it's only, 9 years since the Scottish National Party won 97% of the seats in Scotland, and it's now back to the kind of numbers that it had in the 1970s. So an election that we haven't talked about in this series is 2015, when that extraordinary moment happened. And in some ways, we might see this as the undoing of the 2015 election.
I want to talk about all of those things. And with 1906, we had, 118 years of historical hindsight to work with, and we've got about 10 hours with this election. So it's a little tighter, but, real-time history is fun too. I think there is a fourth thing going on here, which is the thing that for which there is no analogy. And I don't want to overstate it. There's already been some pushback from people saying, the Labour Party won, and that number of seats gives you a very strong base from which to govern the country and do the things in your manifesto. Nonetheless, the turnout, the Labour vote share, and just the numbers of people who voted Labour are far lower, I think, than anyone expected. So last night, watching on different channels at one point, watching on Channel 4, early on in the evening, Anne Widdecombe was celebrating a Reform triumph that didn't quite materialise. But rumours were starting to come through that Labour might have a 180 seat, 70 seat, 80 seat majority on what they were saying was maybe as low as 36% of the vote. And there was a sort of intake of breath from the greybeards around the table and others. Well, it was 33.7%. And turnout was also low. So early in the day, people said, turnout is holding up. It didn't. It was 60%. The Labour Party got 500,000 fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn got last time. Now, the Tory vote completely collapsed, and also there are lots of other things going on. And I saw you wrote yesterday on Twitter, you said, you can't judge parties by the rules of a game that they've not been invited to play. And, the Labour Party has run a very skillful campaign. It's clearly targeted seats. It's very effectively got its vote out where it needs to get its vote out. Nonetheless, there is no historical comparison. This is the lowest vote share for any party to have a majority of any size. It's lower than Tony Blair in 2005. And yet it's an absolutely massive majority. The first past the post system in this case has produced a result that I would describe as not just anomalous, but actually freakish.
Yes, I think democratically it's unquestionably a problem. As you say, this is by a distance the lowest share of the vote on which a party has ever won a majority of any size, let alone the 1997 style size of majority that we're seeing overnight. But I do want to reiterate the point that I made in the tweet, that parties do not set out under first past the post to maximise their share of the vote, because first past the post does not reward them for that. There are no prizes for piling up the largest number of votes. The prizes come from the efficiency of your vote and from where you're able to win, and making sure that you pile up votes in places where they can turn contests. And actually, we've seen two parties, I think, in this election, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, who have been absolutely laser-focused on the question of where they win and with whom they win, not with how many seats they win. Now, I don't like that. That's not the electoral system that I would want to be functioning in. But I don't think that we can criticise parties for playing the rules of the game in which they have to operate. If they want to win elections, they have to win them under the rules of first past the post.
And as you say, there are no rewards for piling up votes. And one of the sights early on in the night is the first two results that came through. Reform did pretty well in safe Labour seats. They got 30% of the vote. And Nigel Farage immediately put out a little video saying, this is amazing. And this is going to translate into an amazing number of seats. And you kind of think, well, you haven't understood the rules of the game. But I do think for those comparisons that you made earlier, which of these elections does it compare to? When might the Tories come back? Is it like 1945? The fact that the Labour vote share is so small and it's in a sense so tight, they won a lot of seats with very, very small majorities. A lot of these seats are very tight. And you have to think about, it's very rare for a government, particularly one that has a large majority, to increase its vote share over the course of a parliament. But the Labour vote share is already pretty low. And at the same time, there are questions here for the Conservative Party, which is, if they want to peel off Labour voters, there aren't actually that many of them relative to all of the other parties. It feels a little bit different. It just feels to me a little more brittle, actually, certainly than 1997. 1997, and I heard people saying this last night. Indeed, Ed Ball said it last night. He said, when we got elected, we were very confident we had a decade. And they weren't wrong. And you might think if they were so confident they had a decade, the timing of some of their choices was slightly weird, but nonetheless, it doesn't feel like that because it just feels very tight. And indeed, for a lot of those Labour MPs, there are quite a lot of questions they have to think about over the course of this Parliament relative to the next election. They can delay it for 4.5, 5 years, but still, relative to 97 in particular, it does feel to me, for instance, more like 1906, actually, which after all was the last time the Liberals ever won a majority of any kind.
Well, we started this series by talking about 1906, and I think we discussed then the fact that landslides are in a way always precarious because landslides happen when the ground becomes unstable, when your foot starts to slip and no one quite knows where they can find a footing anymore. The nature of a landslide is always that parties send to Westminster large numbers of MPs in places where they don't normally win, and often with very small majorities. So in that sense, the problem that Labour faces in this contest isn't particularly new. And there are places where it might be able to pick up support over the course of this Parliament. Quite apart from its performance in government, it's probably unlikely that Gaza, for example, will be such a big issue in 5 years' time. I suspect we'll see some of those independent victories going back to the Labour Party. But yes, it is precarious. And I think another lesson of this series has been that it's a fool's game trying to predict what will happen at the next election when you're standing in the kind of rubble of the previous one. And particularly because first past the post is a system that works if you have basically a two-party system, which is what Britain had for most of the two-party period. It can't really handle multiple players in the system. We talked earlier in the series about how in 1918, Parliament came very close to getting rid of first past the post and replacing it either with PR or with the alternative vote. And part of the case for that was made at the time was we're entering a period of three-party politics, the Conservatives, the Liberals and Labour. So we have to have an electoral system that can handle that. Well, we're probably now in a system of 5 or 6-party politics where the political configurations around the country are going to be very different. And if we're going to stick with first past the post, as I suspect in the short term we are, first past the post is going to deliver increasingly berserk outcomes in that kind of political world.
And just for reference, I just did the quick calculation. If you had a very basic proportional representation system, you just translated vote share into number of MPs, the result would have been Labour 219, the Tories 154, Reform 93, the Lib Dems 80, they're closest to their actual result. And the Greens 44, a very good result for the Greens. And actually out of that, you probably would get a pretty stable, secure majority coalition of Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens. It gets you not massively past 326, but if you add them all up, it gets you past that. And it would be very hard for the Tories or Reform to form the part of any government. But the number that really stands out there is clearly the Labour number.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things perhaps to add there. One is that something that isn't being talked about enough in this election is that when the new Parliament assembles, there will be more than 500 MPs from left or centre-left parties. I don't think we've ever come close to that in the democratic era before. So while it's right that there's so much discussion of reform and the rise of the radical right, actually in some ways this is an extraordinarily left-leaning result. Secondly, I think we have to be a bit careful about translating the vote shares we get under first past the post into a proportional system, because while it's true that the parties are navigating first past the post and allocating their resources accordingly, voters are also trying to make first past the post work. And in a funny way, I think they've become increasingly conscious of the problems of first past the post. And there was a lot of talk before the election about how important it was to promote tactical voting, how important it was that people lent other parties their votes in order to get the outcome that they want. And in the moment the polls close, suddenly it's all about what a terrible share of the vote the governing party got. I think we have to give voters some credit here as well for voting in ways that produced an outcome that they wanted.
I'd like to talk about Scotland because I think it connects to this, actually. So my feeling about Scotland is Scotland actually has been a glimpse of this, the word you used was berserk future, because it's been an extraordinary run of elections in Scotland with these whiplash changes, particularly in the number of seats that parties have. So the Labour Party going from, I think it was 45 or 46 to 1 seat in 2015. The election, as you said, where the SNP went from 6 to 56. So they went from, their traditional, very small share to just about every single seat in the country. And now we've had the reverse of that. Labour only had 1 seat in Scotland. And now they're in the high 30s. They haven't all been declared yet. The SNP has lost 4/5 of their number of seats. The vote share shifts have been significant, but nothing on that scale. And I think it's partly because Scotland was ahead of the rest of the UK. Scotland has been a 4-party contest for a decade now. And that's what produces some of these anomalous outcomes, so that a party that does well, because of the way that the other parties distribute across different constituencies, can suddenly find themselves either cleaning up or they do badly and they're wiped out. I mean, it's not, in some constituencies, it's not a 4-party contest. But if you look at, there's a significant number of seats in which it is the division of the opposition vote that allows Labour in, as it was with the SNP. The SNP didn't win 90+% of the seats or 90+% of the vote. But Scotland has been not just a 3-party, but a 4-party, because the Lib Dems have definitely had their moment. The Tories have come and gone. Labour's been up and down like a yo-yo. It feels to me a little like Scotland was ahead of the game in exposing the way in which first past the post produces results, which, if we are moving into an era of 5 or 6-party politics in the rest of the UK, then, Reform and the Greens along with the other 3, and then you've got the Nationalists in Wales, and Plaid did well, and in Scotland. That kind of thing would, unless you change the voting system, be the new normal. So Scotland, weirdly, I think, gave a glimpse here of what was coming. And like you, I think it wasn't commented on enough. That 2015 result was astonishing, but it's even more astonishing if you think that less than a decade later, we've got a kind of mirror image of it. From 40 plus to 1 and then from 1 nearly back to 40 is amazing. There's no historical comparison for that.
Yes, and it's surprising, I think, that what's happened in Scotland over the last 10 years wasn't taken more seriously by unionist parties as an argument in itself for electoral reform. If you had had a more representative system, then in 2015, you would still have had half of Scotland's MPs coming from parties of the union. You would almost certainly have had Scottish politicians sitting on the front benches of the other major parties. You would have had the Conservatives and Labour both having to think about their support bases in Scotland and indeed in Wales. That obviously hasn't happened, but I think this has been a very good election for the Union. It's not that long ago that each country of the United Kingdom was producing a different election result, was producing a different winning party. And that really heightened the sense that elections only really mattered in the United Kingdom when they happened in England, that the makeup of a government in Westminster was exclusively decided by English politicians appealing for English votes. And if you want to hold the union together, the kind of result we got last night is a much more stable foundation on which to build. But I think if we're thinking about Scotland as a signpost rather than an anomaly, I suspect we are going to see that volatility continuing. If the Labour government is not regarded as a success in Scotland, then the obvious result against them at the next election is going to be a big return to the SNP. It's not clear that support for independence is significantly lower than it was a couple of years ago. I think it's entirely possible that we see an SNP campaign at the next election, which is saying, look, we've experienced the horrors of a Conservative government. We've experienced the failures of a Labour government. The only alternative here is to step outside Westminster altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen descriptions of the independence question being put to bed for a generation. I think we know about these referendum questions. People always say a generation. It's weird. With referendums, they always say a generation. With general elections, the time horizons are much shorter, but actually it rarely is a generation. On the one hand, the unionists might say the gamble on first past the post, we had to hold our nerve, but in the end it worked for us, because it also means when it goes wrong for the SNP, we changed the voting system for the Scottish parliamentary elections. They've been in power for a long time. And one of the things you could say about this election is it's the parties of government that have been punished. And you could almost include the DUP in that. I mean, I don't know if we want to spend much time talking about Northern Ireland. We might. It's not my area of expertise by any means. But nonetheless, the DUP have done badly. The unionist vote has fractured a bit in Northern Ireland. The DUP, until recently, were the party of government there. The parties of government have been punished. And in a way, therefore, the unionists could say allowing the SNP to govern Scotland was the gamble that paid off in relation to independence, because now we've seen them off at Westminster. But I agree with you. The gamble is a permanent gamble. It's not a gamble that gets settled by a general election. You throw the dice or toss the coin or whatever it is, and then you've got to toss it again a few years later or throw the dice again. And the landslide is a landslide in lots of different directions. I think it's one of those landslides where it's not a swingometer, just like the land has shifted from right to left. It's kind of, it's like it's fractured. These gaps have opened up and the land is moving in different directions. And so it's just unstable. It's still a big gamble. I think that the independence question is dead for this parliament, for sure. But like you say, now these time horizons are shorter again.
I honestly think anybody who thinks that they can predict confidently what's going to happen in the next 5 years, or which questions are open and which questions are closed, must have been in some kind of a coma for the last decade. If there's anything that we've learned in recent British politics, it's that politics isn't a kind of fixed landscape. It's a swirling sea in which you're tossed around and you're changing direction and you don't know where you're pointing. There are lots of reasons why British politics has been so volatile over recent years. It's partly to do with demographic change. It's partly because big questions around things like the future of the Union or Britain's relations with Europe have been reactivated. It's partly because of things like the economic decline of the West. It's partly because of things like climate change. It's about our ageing population. Now, with the possible exception of relations with Europe, none of those questions has closed. None of them is more clearly resolved today than it was 2 days ago. And so Labour has an opportunity now. It has, if you like, a kind of big ship with which to steer through this sea. But it hasn't shut down any of the things that have been making British politics so unpredictable.
Do you think, just to touch on Northern Ireland, do you think the fact that Sinn Féin are now, for the first time ever, are now the largest party in Westminster from Northern Irish constituencies, because the unionist vote, it seems to have fractured in some ways, as I understand it, that have some parallels with what's going on elsewhere in the UK. Is that significant, or should one not read too much into Westminster results in Northern Irish politics?
Well, I wouldn't claim to be a particular expert on the politics of Northern Ireland, and I think there can be a danger from those of us who aren't specialists in the politics of Northern Ireland in opining upon it. But my instinct would be that it's going to depend much more on what happens in the politics of the Republic than in the politics of Westminster, and whether Sinn Féin is able to really establish itself as the leading force there. And also the continuing fallout from Brexit, that what is trade going to look like across the Irish Sea? How well is the Windsor framework going to work out? I suspect those questions are going to have more impact.
So let's go back to the Tories. One of the points you raised at the beginning, there's a huge question now as to where the party goes and how it tries to rebuild. It is still clearly the opposition. In the worst case scenarios, there was talk of the Conservative number of seats and the Liberal Democrats number of seats being very close to each other, or possibly even crossing over. That didn't happen, though. The gap is not that wide. It's 50 seats. That's very striking. The Conservatives have 121 seats. They've lost some potential leadership candidates like Penny Mordaunt. There were some quite weirdly varied results. Jeremy Hunt kept his seat. Ian Duncan-Smith kept his seat. Liz Truss lost her seat in an extraordinary distribution of the votes, a seat in which the fourth place candidate got more than 14% of the vote, and the winning candidate only just got over 26% of the vote. I mean, that's a real four-way split. And the fourth candidate there was an independent who almost certainly cost Liz Truss the seat. But the focus, certainly in the commentary in the few hours as the rubble is settling, has been on reform. Nigel Farage is in Parliament. They didn't do as well as the exit poll suggested, but they have now a number of MPs. As things stand, there may be one more, but as things stand, no more than the Greens, which is in itself remarkable. But Reform did well in number of votes, but it didn't do particularly better than UKIP did in its most successful campaigns. It's got a few more MPs, a handful, not even a handful. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. But the talk is, the Tories have got to rebuild from somewhere. So who or what are they targeting? Who or what are they trying to persuade to either come back into the fold or to give them another look? There will always be the talk in a low turnout election that it was people who stayed at home who are the ones they've got to re-energise and reconnect with. It's probably implausible, as I mentioned earlier, for Tories to think, given the relative paucity of the Labour vote, that they're going to get back in the game by peeling off millions of Labour voters. It seems to me almost inevitable that their focus will be on those Reform voters. I find it hard to think that as various of them pitch for the leadership and then they start thinking about what kind of opposition they want to be, even though Reform only have 4 or 5 MPs, that it doesn't preoccupy them. Do you think there's a way they can see the bigger picture, or do you think the Reform shadow is going to haunt them now, certainly in the next months or even years?
I think the danger for the Conservative Party is that they treat what happened last night as an anomaly and as something that simply happens because the Reform Party, as they see it, splits the right-wing vote, and that if they can simply reunite that, looking at Labour's low share of the vote, there's every reason to believe they can come back again in 2029. I think the situation they're in is more serious than that, and they need to be thinking over a longer period of time. With the exception of 2019, and as we discussed in a previous episode, in some ways that is an anomalous election because of the centrality of getting Brexit done and a Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn. They haven't won a substantial majority in Parliament since 1987. If we think about their time in government over the last 14 years, they've tried quite a variety of different forms of conservatism. We've had the kind of modernisers of Cameron and Osborne. We've then had the kind of reheated Chamberlainism of Theresa May and the kind of cakes and ale conservatism of Boris Johnson. I don't know quite how you categorise the Liz Truss period, but a sort of Gloriana version of Thatcherism. And then the attempt to project at least a more sort of technocratic early Thatcherism of Rishi Sunak. And none of those things has established them a clear foothold with the electorate. So there is some fundamental problem here. All our parties are facing structural obstacles. It's not just the Conservatives that have been struggling in recent years, but the Conservatives are looking at an increasingly elderly vote. They're increasingly being pushed out of entire areas of the electoral map, which is something that First Past the Post doesn't like and doesn't reward. They're now being pulled in 2 different directions by Reform on the one hand and the Liberal Democrats on the other. And I think what they need is something like what they went through after 1945, where there was a real attempt to intellectually revivify the party. There were a whole series of major policy committees, big documents like the Industrial Charter, a real emphasis on party education, on changing how the party talked to electors and how it listens to them. I fear that the instant response to 2024 might actually make that kind of more considered response less likely.
And of course, in 1945, one of the reasons they were able to do that was that they were able to park the leadership question, and they really did park it. Whereas partly because of the way politics is now, the extraordinary focus on leadership, partly because we're all interested in a good horse race, and this one looks like it has all the makings of being quite an exciting horse race. I was looking at the betting odds. Kemi Badenoch is the favourite. Tom Tugendhat is the second favourite, and then Priti Patel and Suella Braverman. One can imagine that being quite a lively contest, not least which of the 2 of them go to the members. It's also interesting. I have to say, I need to be careful how I say this, but it is interesting that of those 4 candidates, the 3 who might be more seen to appeal to the Reform end of the dilemma that the party faces are not just all women, but none of them are white. And Reform, we've learned some things about some aspects of the Reform demographic. So it's all quite, in its own way, I think, quite brittle. But none of them seems like the obvious answer to the question, I have to say. I can imagine each of those 4 in a different way making a pitch, but it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that you were describing. It feels like the pitch is already baked in with each of those 4, actually. And it's not an exploration of an open future, which in a way 1945 forced the Conservative Party to do because the world had, it really was a new world. And we're not quite there yet.
If the Conservative Party were to phone up and ask for my advice, which I think is extraordinarily unlikely, I would first encourage them to try and decide what the question is before they decide what the answer to that question might be. They're going to be largely irrelevant over the coming year. They can actually afford to take their time over the question of the leadership. I don't think they will do this. It's the hardest thing to do when you're panicking, is simply to stop and breathe. But I think they would be very wise to take at least 6 months, if not 9 months, so that they can assess what happened last night. They can get a clearer picture of the political world in which they're now operating. They can start to get some sense of the strengths and weaknesses of the incoming Labour government, and they can give some more exposure to younger members of the party who are not very familiar to the public, or indeed to their own party members. I think if they did that, they would have a clearer sense of what it is they need to achieve, and a clearer sense of who the candidates were that might help them to do it.
As you said earlier, one of the remarkable features of this result is the sheer number of MPs that one could characterise as being on the centre-left. The Green Party, I don't know how you would characterise the Green Party now, but the Green Party are to the left of Labour. I was struck watching telly last night that the person they had on talking about the Green Party was Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, who seems to me not actually a typical representative. He seemed to me a throwback to maybe to an earlier version of green politics, because environmentalism is still at the heart of it, but it is not the be-all and end-all of green politics. And they did do very well. The Liberal Democrats did extremely well. We still need to include, I think, Plaid and the SNP as centre-left parties. And yet here is Labour with this thumping majority. But to what extent can those other parties, if at all, shape or influence the direction of centre-left politics? For instance, the Liberal Democrats. I mean, some of the votes that Labour will want to get through, they will get through easily. I recorded a conversation recently with Helen Thompson in which she said one of the interesting questions for Labour and the size of its majority is the hardest thing to do in British politics is to reform the planning laws, because MPs are all in favour of it except in their own backyards. And then it turns out they all have backyards, and local constituents get on their high horses very, very quickly. And it's possible that with a majority of this scale, Labour can do some of that, on which their growth programme does depend. I suspect the Liberal Democrats will try and block some of that, actually, the kind of politics that they stand for. The Greens, likewise. One can imagine gaps opening up on the centre-left on some questions, but maybe on other questions less so. I mean, even on international questions, the question of Palestine, for instance. This parliament has seen elected to it a number of independents, which is quite rare. And as you said, it may not last. And it includes Jeremy Corbyn too, we should hasten to add. He did win last night. I'm struggling to see the shape of this. I can see on the one hand, Labour can just do what they like. They've got the biggest majority, imaginable in some circumstances. But there are a lot of MPs from other parties who offer a similar but different version of centre-left politics. Can they shape it, do you think?
Well, one of the curiosities of the British governing system is that whether the Liberal Democrats have 7 MPs or 75 actually makes almost no difference to their capacity to influence legislation. The British system is very brutal in its majoritarianism. There was a lot of nonsense talked over the last couple of weeks about supermajorities. The nature of Britain's constitution is that all majorities are supermajorities. If you have a majority of 1, then you can abolish the monarchy, you can reform the electoral system, you can nationalise Taylor Swift, you can do whatever you like. And the opposition parties really can't stop that. But what it does give them is a kind of pulpit. It gives them airtime. One of the horrors of this election campaign has been there's a recognition that if you're Ed Davey and you want to get a hearing for what's been the third force in British politics over about 20 years, you have to fall off a paddleboard or leap off a bungee rope or be fired out of a cannon. It will be much easier for the Liberal Democrats and to some extent for the Green Party to have their voices heard and to be part of the conversation, and particularly to be part of the critical conversation about what Labour does. So although we might want to think of this as a kind of progressive majority across the House, the reality is that what will get these parties airtime is attacking what Labour is trying to do.
The Liberal Democrats also, the only other way they influence the direction of a government's travel is with spectacular by-election successes, and there may be 1 or 2 of those we don't know. By-elections in this parliament, I suspect, will be extremely interesting. Do you think there is at all a trend here? I'm trying to ask you to speculate. You've already said twice anyone who speculates about the future is ill-advised. But is there at all a trend here towards the possibility of independents winning constituencies by focusing on local issues, single issues? There was a glimpse of it earlier in the Rochdale by-election George Galloway lost and Labour are back there. But the really fascinating thing was the guy who came second in the by-election, who was this local garage owner, Dave Tully, I think he was called, who just stood on a completely local platform. His manifesto was only related to Rochdale stuff, including the football club, the maternity ward, the childcare in the constituency, and he did very well. It seems to me it's at least possible. There is just the glimmering of some people maybe thinking in this volatile landscape where the land hasn't just slid, it's kind of moving around, that independent candidates are potentially viable. I'm not sure. I think it's a really interesting question. The thing I was most surprised by overnight between going to sleep and waking up was the fact that these Labour seats had been lost to the independents basically on a Gaza protest vote. And others came very, very close to being lost. Jess Phillips, Wes Streeting and others. It may be a one-off. And on that issue, it may be a one-off, for sure. There are rumours of peace deals brewing even as we speak. I don't know if Keir Starmer will be able to claim the credit, but Joe Biden for sure is going to try. Who knows? But on other questions, my instinct, which may be completely off, suggests to me that this is at least a possible, maybe low-key direction of travel for British politics if we stick with first past the post. That kind of localism could have teeth.
It is something that we've seen in local politics, and I think in some ways it's surprising that it hasn't pushed further into national politics. So, for example, quite a lot of my family live in Frome, down in Somerset. Frome is one of those places where the local council has been completely colonised by Frome independents. The established parties have been wiped out, and at successive local elections, the Frome independents have won every single seat on the council. And that suggests that there is an appetite for a certain kind of localism, that there is political profit to be gained from being able to say that I am the voice of a particular place. I'm not the representative of a party in this particular place. But of course, it is harder to translate that into national politics, because you can't stand up and say what you're going to do to the NHS. You can't stand up and talk about your grand plans for government, or how many nurses you'll create, or how many doctors you will recruit. It's also quite difficult, I think, to actually carry out the duties of an MP as an independent. And I think I don't say that as a positive. I think that's a really problematic trend. It's very hard for independents to know what they're voting on in the House of Commons without a whipping system. And it's difficult to maintain the kind of apparatus that you need to do serious constituency work and to be the kind of constituency MP that you can be if you have a party machine behind you and you have support workers and you have reasonably good networks of information around different parts of a constituency. So when it happens, it tends to be either on some kind of big mobilising issue like Gaza, or perhaps there is some kind of scope for it to happen around these local governments, these local councils, which become kind of de facto regional parties.
And as you say, I was going to say what's so striking about the independents who defeated the Labour candidates this time round is it's local politics, but it's local politics projected through an international issue, never mind a national issue. It is the local politics of Gaza in these constituencies. I believe some people are also saying we must be careful about just pigeonholing all of it. There's usually a local dynamic at work as well. I'm also reminded of something we talked about in the 1997 episode, and actually for people who get our newsletter, and if you don't, do sign up. The link is in the show description for this episode. We've got lots of clips, TV clips and other things from past elections, and it includes I'd forgotten the great showdown between Martin Bell and Neil Hamilton, sort of gunfight at the OK Corral, and there's a great footage of Martin Bell sort of marching in his white suit to face off against Neil Hamilton. And Martin Bell felt at the time like he might be the beginning of something, the symbolism of the man in the white suit, but he really wasn't, not least because it was very hard, as you say, for him, having won, as it will probably be for these independents, to do a damn thing in Parliament. And 1997 felt a little bit like it was the beginning of that. There have been candidates who've been elected, doctors who've been elected on basically not just an NHS platform, but a kind of local hospital NHS platform. But it rarely amounts to much. And yet there's a little part of me that just thinks some people might look at this election in particular and the mix of volatility, the range of results. The exit poll was bang on the big picture, the sort of headline news, but under the surface, there were some extraordinary results. Liz Truss lost because an independent stood against her, a sort of old-style Tory who took enough votes off her in a seat that was completely split, that people might think there's more opportunity than there was. And I don't know, but I have a feeling this election might be galvanizing in that respect.
I think there is a big structural opportunity which didn't exist 20, 30 years ago, in that Britain used to have very deep-rooted attachments to parties, that the parties had quite strong roots in the trade union movement for the Labour Party, in voluntary society for the Conservative Party. That's largely gone. And in its place, there is now a very strong hostility to the established parties. And in that sense, we might want to put the election of these independents alongside the reform phenomenon, that a lot of the reform vote is about a real rejection, a desire to express rejection of the established parties and the established ways of doing politics. So one of the challenges for the new government is whether it can, to some extent, re-establish trust in politics and drain some of the anger, the anti-system anger out, which is feeding the reform surge, but is also feeding these independent candidatures. And if it can't do that, and you potentially find yourself in an electoral scenario in which there is very little enthusiasm for any of the main established parties, and of course all sorts of different things become possible.
You said a little earlier that you assume we will keep the electoral system that we've got. One of the ironies that many people have pointed out, that the Liberal Democrats who've complained about this system forever, they would have done better under straight proportional representation with all the caveats that you mentioned, that the vote share doesn't really compute to what people might do under a PR system. And no PR system is as straightforward as that anyway. But nonetheless, this time round, they were some of the beneficiaries. The big losers were Reform, I think, followed by the Green Party. I tend to agree with you. Proportional representation or changing the voting system is the thing that never quite arrives, not least because the people who've just won, it's not top of their list because they've done quite well under the existing system. Do you think there's any possibility, nonetheless, of some constitutional reform? I mean, people have thought, are the Labour Party finally going to reform the House of Lords? And if they do, is there a possibility that they would introduce a more proportional system there? I think they might be quite wary of that because it creates alternative bases of legitimacy in democratic politics. But Labour have done very well, but I think their position is brittle in some ways. And actually, when I looked at those figures, I thought there's quite an attractive coalition government. I mean, I don't even mean attractive from a particular political standpoint, but that just looks like quite a good fit in some ways. I think a Labour, Lib Dem, Green government would be interesting in various ways, and some of the ways in which each of them would have to compromise, I think, would be interesting. The coalition government of 2010 to 2015 was problematic in some ways, but stable in others. What people remember about it is that the junior partner got wiped out, so never enter a coalition, but only got wiped out because it was the first past the post system. Do you think there's any likelihood at all that in this parliament there will be a serious look at some of the constitutional bases of our politics?
I would love this to be a parliament of constitutional reform. I don't think as Democrats we should be at all relaxed about the fact that 40% of the electorate didn't turn up yesterday in what was clearly an election in which big change was possible. We shouldn't be relaxed about the intensely distorted effects that first past the post is producing, or the fact that potentially millions of people feel like their votes are being flushed down the toilet. That is not healthy, ultimately, for the stability of our system. It's not healthy for democratic trust, and we should want to do something about that. I'm afraid, though, I think it is very unlikely. I don't think Labour wants to go down that route. As we've discussed in previous episodes, it's really hard to persuade a party that has just overperformed under first past the post that one of the first things it should do is give up those advantages, especially when it's won a very low share of the vote, which means the effect of PR is going to be really punishing if you're assuming that that is the likely outcome. So those of us who want constitutional reform, I don't think we should be sitting around waiting for the parties to do it. I think in a sense, it becomes our responsibility as citizens, if that's what we believe, to keep making the arguments, to keep making the case, so that if you do encounter a moment, a hung parliament, or some kind of political scenario in which it is necessary to barter for the support of a party like the Liberal Democrats or indeed Reform, then that becomes an idea to which people are accustomed, an idea with which they're familiar, and doesn't seem a kind of bolt from the sky in a way that it did in the AV referendum in 2011.
Some of the talk last night was of the fact that over the coming months, one of the things that the Labour Party will inevitably do is throw their hands up in horror and say, oh my God, it's even worse than we thought. The Office of Budget Responsibility are going to find an even bigger hole in the public finances. And there will be a space in which they can say, we inherited a real mess. It doesn't tend to last for long, but it's possible over the coming months, maybe the next 6 months or the next year, there is some scope to say, though we made all of these commitments in our manifesto, we need a bit more wriggle room because we didn't know the full scale of the horror of what the Tories had done to this country and its finances over the last 14 years. Nonetheless, they do face some pretty tough choices, and they have boxed themselves in on various questions, tax raises and so on, and yet, committed to improving public services. Almost everyone says this government's fate will probably depend on people feeling that, particularly, I think, public services improve. And they have pinned their colours to the growth mast. That's a hideous phrase. I don't even know what it means, but I think we know what it means. I mean, growth is their way out. That also looks to me a little brittle, a little fragile. Do you think there's scope in the next 6 to 9 months to be a little blunter with the public, partly on the grounds that, having got behind these desks and seen what's in the ledger, they need a little bit of a rethink?
I'm sure there'll be some trimming around the edges. But I would be very surprised if Labour did anything that was radically against the pledges it's made in the election campaign on tax. I think it has boxed itself in too far to do that. And I also think it genuinely believes in its growth programme. And actually, I think we are potentially about to witness quite an interesting experiment that should have been talked about more during the election campaign. Because if we were looking for big differences between the two parties in this election, the question of economic management was absolutely one. The Conservatives were very explicit that their mantra for growth was tax cuts. If you look at their manifesto, it is tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, with a sub-theme of using our Brexit freedoms to deregulate. So there's a very kind of Thatcherite vision there of how you propel economic growth. Labour, on the other hand, has to some extent reanimated a social democratic programme of the 20th century, which believes that they really can run the economy better by an interventionist and active state. A state that doesn't just improve the kind of planning climate and the legislative framework for the economy, but that actually partners with the market, that tries actively to promote and to some extent to direct investment. Now, for most of the 20th century, that was a key dividing line between the two parties, and we've simply ignored it in this campaign. Largely because I think very few people in the media believe that it is possible to generate growth through government. So the assumption is it will fail, and then we have to move on to the question of tax rises. That may indeed be the case, but it means that we didn't actually talk about how is Labour planning to stimulate growth? What is it proposing to do? Might this work? What other things might work instead? Labour's bet the farm on that. If it doesn't work, then it's going to face some really quite existential decisions. But I don't think we should assume at this point in time that it won't.
I was very struck last night, again, watching the coverage on one of the channels. Andy Burnham was there and he was talking to Rachel Reeves, and he said, and this partly follows on the recent local election results where, with the exception of Ben Houchin in the northeast, the regional mayors in the big cities are Labour mayors. He said, we're shovel ready. I mean, I'm paraphrasing him, but we've got all this stuff actually ready to go. For a long time, there's been a lot of hostility between central government and often Labour-based local government and local authorities and mayoral authorities as well. And he was saying, actually, there's an enormous amount that we can do and we're ready to do around building and transport and so on, but we can do it together. There has been a certain amount of devolution in this country, not a huge amount, but a certain amount of devolution. But this will be the first time for a long time when the mayors of the devolved regions and the central government are on the same side. And that is at least potentially one of the drivers of growth, I think.
And if we believe that incompetent government is harmful, then it must follow from that more competent government can be productive. Now, whether Labour will provide that, we don't know. But when we look at how many planning ministers there have been over the last few years, how many extraordinary changes of economic policy there have been, it must be possible to do this better. I think in a way the problem for Labour is that whether it's able to achieve growth is only very partly in its own hands. It could do all the things it's proposing. They could all work wonderfully, and China could invade Taiwan, and the whole thing's off. Or some other kind of external global shock hits the economy, or some kind of climate shock. It's not wholly up to the government of one country whether it succeeds in growing the economy or not. And Labour is betting a very great deal on its capacity to do that.
That's the last question I wanted to ask you. This morning, as I was reading the coverage in different places, I was reading the New York Times, made this the main story, quite good coverage of what was going on in Britain. But they also had an article just below that, which had clearly been written earlier, had nothing to do with Britain. And it was about the political crises that are breaking out all over the world, and do they have anything in common? And it was a sort of panoptic vision of global political breakdown, from Bolivia and Argentina to France and Belgium to Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Kenya. And by political breakdown, we're talking here about violence, attempted coups, riots in the streets, people feeling that they can't afford food, and so on. Not so much that latter in France and Belgium, but nonetheless, the feeling was that politics has got an edge of violence to it. It's extremely volatile, and this is being driven by a series of global factors that are common between these very different places. Enormous debt overhang, inflation and its effect particularly on food prices, climate and the climate crisis, and so on. And reading that in the same paper as writing this sort of conventional account of how well Labour have done, and thank goodness the New York Times are saying those awful Tories have gone, and so on and so on. And this looks like a sort of reversion to something in British politics, something that they thought was relatively familiar. And yet at the same time, here's a description of a global political breakdown. And the background event in that New York Times story that wasn't about Britain is what might happen in the United States later this year, where, again, the risk of violence is real. And also a political system might simply cease to function. I mean, I think we're all aware that some of Keir Starmer's problems may stem from the failure of what was once the flagship democratic system in the world. And I couldn't decide, is British politics an outlier in this story? Or actually, if you look a bit deeper, you can fit it into that story. You hinted you could fit it into that story. You talked about, some of these things that are going on that are, the word you used was unresolved, but they're live and raw, some of them. The intergenerational questions, we haven't even discussed the possibility that I know people take very seriously, some people who are very well informed, others disagree with them and some ridicule them, but that what's about to happen in AI is of a scale and a magnitude in the next 18 months to 3 years that we haven't begun to wrap our heads around. I couldn't decide when reading that whether I wanted to say what happened last night made British politics a little bit of a reassuring outlier, or actually we should look beneath the surface and take very seriously the fact that this Labour government too is, it's bobbing on that sea.
In a way, I think that takes us to the central paradox of this election. If an alien came down from space and just looked at the results of what had happened last night, they would say this is an earthquake of an election in terms of the scale of Labour's victory, the shattering of what happened to the Conservatives, the new political forces that seem to have been unleashed electorally. And yet it didn't remotely feel, I think, like an earthquake election while we were living through it. It felt, in fact, like an extraordinary, static and really quite tedious election. It's not an election in which we talked, let alone made any big decisions, about any of the big questions that you've just identified. We didn't talk about the ageing society. We didn't talk about AI. We didn't talk about the continuing problems of public debt or the funding of public services. We didn't talk about the security of Europe. You wouldn't know that there was a climate crisis going on from any of really the discussion in the election. And so there is a disconnect between what we talked about in this election and the things that actually are at stake. I think that speaks to a number of problems with our politics, with the way that politics is covered, with the torrential obsession with the polls in this, which meant that we spent the whole period assuming that we knew the results. There was no point talking about the choices in front of us, in which we were simply commenting upon the race rather than attempting to debate the choice. But it does mean that we've come out of this moment, which should be a kind of moment of refreshment and rejuvenation and gathering of strength in a democracy, really no further on in relation to those questions than we were before the election began. Those questions haven't gone away. And more than anything else, what will determine the viability of this government, what happens in 5 years' time, and the future stability of British politics is going to be whether the incoming government can respond to those questions any more successfully, either than the previous government or than the conversation we had in bringing it to power.
As I mentioned in that conversation, our newsletter is out now to accompany this series. It's got all sorts of clips, video clips, audio clips connected to the elections that we've been discussing. It's got a guide to those elections, what happened. It's also got some immediate reactions from me and from Robert to what happened in the election that's just gone by. If you'd like to sign up, just click on the link in our show description. It's very easy, and you will get that free newsletter every fortnight. Also a reminder that if you want to get the missing episode in this series, if you haven't yet heard 1924, and I know I keep talking about it, just sign up to PPF Plus. Again, the link is in the show description, or you go to ppfideas.com. You get all of our bonus episodes, 24 bonus episodes a year. You get ad-free listening. You will automatically get the newsletter. It just costs £5 a month, or £50 if you sign up for the year. We finished this series, so we're returning to what we were doing before Rishi Sunak interrupted. I'm going to finish my series about the great political fictions with some 21st century fictions, including Hamilton, but also Alan Hollinghurst's The Line of Beauty, Curtis Sittenfield's American Wife, and I'm also going to be talking to some regular contributors about their favourite political novels and plays. Leah Ippey on Ibsen's Wild Duck, Helen Lewis on To Kill a Mockingbird, and others. We really hope you've enjoyed this series, and do please join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.